Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our next installment of the Project Management Training Webinar Series. Today, we're going to be going over PD&E Project Management 101. Dat Nguyen down in District 6 will be presenting to us today. Just before we start, a couple of house cleaning items. Make sure, you'll be on mute the entire time. However, if you have any questions, you can, on your go-to dashboard, you can ask us a good question, and we'll at some point make sure we address that question throughout the webinar. If there's any additional questions that you do have post-webinar, you'll have my information. This is Bobby Lowell and Brian Martin's information on the last slide, so you can send us a message if there's something you think of after the webinar. Also, we're at the point now where we're getting everything into learning curve so that you can get credits for attending this course. If there's someone who's listening in with you, if you have multiple people, if you're in a conference room in your office, and they are also attending but not actually signed in, please send me or Brian or both of us an email just to make sure that that individual also gets credit for the course. With that, we'll get rolling, and Brian will do our introductions.
Good morning, everyone. Like Bobby said, welcome to the fourth installment of the Project Management Webinar Series. Today's focus is on PD&E. The instructor is going to be Mr. Dat Nguyen. Dat graduated from FIU with a Bachelor in Science and Civil Engineering and is a registered professional engineer. He started his career with the Florida Department of Transportation in 1994. He then went through the PE training program where he did his specialization in the Environmental Managed Office, performing project scoping and in-house project development and environment studies. He also worked at Miami-Dade County Department of Environmental Resource Management as an environmental permit engineer for the Solid Waste Program and Pollution Remediation Program. He left government work in 2003 to work for consultant engineering firms doing constructability, bidability review, PD&E studies, planning studies, transit studies, and roadway design. In 2009, he rejoined the department as the district project development engineer and has been working on PD&E studies, as well as working hand in hand with traffic operations, transportation system management, and operation program. In his current role as the district planning and environmental administrator, he works with planning, PD&E, scoping, value engineering, environmental management unit. All right, Dat, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Again, we're going to be going through the PD&E, or Project Development Environment Project Management 101, the very basics of managing a PD&E study. We have a couple of learning objectives from this study, so this course. So at the end of this session, you should be able to list the key components of a project development environment project. Also know how to best accomplish the task required by a PD&E study. Okay, so where are we? This is again the fourth installment of the project management series. We went through the coordination with the local governments and the planning, and then we're going to do the programming, and then on to the PD&E itself. So when looking at PD&E, and you'll hear a lot of acronyms, it becomes almost another language. So you hear people speak about PD&E, CE, EA, EIS, and there's going to be a list of acronyms. So I listed some of these acronyms here for your reference, and you'll be hearing, like I said, it's a whole new set of acronyms when you're dealing with PD&Es. So PD&E, again, it starts off with the NEPA. And what is NEPA? So NEPA is the National Environment Policy Act of 1969. So it requires the consideration of environmental effects and also the analysis of reasonable alternatives, looking at the environmental issues as the natural, human, and physical environment, and it's required by the code and the laws. And it, again, you have to look at the affected parties and how it impacts them, and also the alternatives to avoid and minimize those alternatives. So NEPA applies to a project that has federal funds, if it's on a state road, and also it's in an interstate or federal transportation facility program. NEPA approval, the actions required also when there is a permit that's required by the federal agencies such as the Army Corps, EPA, etc. And also projects that are required for approval from any other federal agencies. So for FDOT, when we speak about NEPA or PD&E, or when you speak about PD&E rather, in Florida, you're talking about the NEPA. Okay, so the PD&E process is the state procedure that complies with NEPA. And everything's documented in the PD&E manual, which can be accessed through the website there, and that's for your reference. As of last year, we also went through NEPA assignment. So NEPA assignment now for the federal action and approval for the NEPA projects within Florida will be signed off by the department. So in the PD&E manual is comprised of two different volumes, part one, which outlines the process and guidelines of the PD&E manual, and part two is the analysis and the documentation of the PD&E. So the manual is used in conjunction with other FDOT handbooks, such as the plans preparation manual, the traffic manual, and other manuals as well, and the design standard. And that can also be accessed through the website. And one important thing with the project and the PD&E manual is always make sure that you're using the manual that is on the website, because it has the most current information. So you're not using an old, the blue binder, the original blue manuals or a desk reference that you may have, or even a downloaded version. Always make sure that you are using the latest version that is on the website. So what leads up to a PD&E? The PD&E process really begins back in the ETDM process, or the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making process, which is composed of the planning screen as well as the programming screen. And then the PD&E process itself includes the data collection, engineering analysis, environmental analysis, the public and community involvement aspect of the project, and then the final documentation for approval. Okay, so the PD&E process is again defined in that PD&E manual, and it flows again from ETDM planning screen to programming screen. And that is all done before the PD&E begins. In the ETDM planning screen, we're looking at the comprehensive planning, the land use, mobility, development of the alternatives, cost feasible plans, and screening it through with the Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or the ETAT, coordination, and the MPO, and looking at any potential dispute resolution process. And from there, I'll go on to the programming screen. Now, again, this is not typically done on every project, but the programming screen has to be completed prior to PD&E depending on the level of the project and what it entails. So again, from the planning screen, it goes into looking at the projects and the priorities. The programming screen also begins the advanced notification to the agencies, making sure that it's consistent with the long-range plans and other plans. Also identifies what technical studies needs to be done. This also helps with determining the class of action through the consultations with the agency or the lead agency. and helps produce the scope of service to begin the PD&E study. So again, some of the key features of the ETDM process. Okay, it begins the early and continuous coordination with the agencies and the community involvement, early identification of potential avoidance, minimization, and mitigation opportunities. It also allowed access to a graphical information system data that is in a standardized format for everyone to see and analyze. It begins identification of any potential key issues, and it maximizes the use of technology for coordination and project screening. So along with the ETDM process and PD&E, we also have the statewide accelerated transformation, or the SWAT process. And the SWAT process includes also having a SWAT team in every district. And the SWAT team is composed of an interdisciplinary or cross-functional multidisciplinary team of DOT staff with experience in project delivery. So the SWAT team typically includes people from the work program, intermodal system development or planning, design, environmental management office, and other offices that may be deemed appropriate within each district. And the goal here for the SWAT process is to identify the level of overlap between the project development and design, which can really accelerate the process, and also identify what elements of a PD&E can be done ahead of time before entering a PD&E. So what is project development? Okay, and the whole purpose of the project development is to, again, determine the engineering solution which is environment feasible that can provide the transportation need. So the need here, again, that purpose and need really drives the process and the project. And again, the process coordinates and documents everything within the PD&E study and documents it in that reports and the final environmental documents for approval. So this is just an introduction of some typical tasks that is accomplished within a PD&E study. Again, that identification of the project needs, the data collection, development alternatives, environmental analysis, the reports, the public involvement, coordination, evaluation of the alternatives, and of course the recommended alternative, value engineering, and documentation. So what happens in PD&E? Again, as the project manager, okay, all that needed assignment needs to be identified early. Who's going to be doing what? When is everything going to be needed? So the process flows of the whole entire PD&E study, which goes into that schedule and how to develop the alternatives. What is the basis for selecting those alternatives? What are the required engineering aspects that's required? And also, again, the coordination between the different offices, and make sure that you hold the SWAT kickoff meeting before the project begins. So the SWAT process, the SWAT streamlines the project development process. Again, it looks at the project early on at the district level meetings to select those candidate projects for funding. Again, it involves the multidisciplinary team. It assesses any project tasks and schedules, and the identification of the pre-PD&E activities, and any opportunities for overlap. So again, all projects right now goes through the SWAT process. So again, there's a difference, a slight difference between a SWAT process and a SWAT project. The process is the process of identifying all the stuff that you see in front of you here, and any activities that happen before PD&E and the overlap opportunities. And a SWAT project is a state-only project or state-only funded project. So A slight distinction, but everything again goes through the SWOT process, regardless of the funding. So in the PD&E study, again, and what do you do before a PD&E begins? This is scope development, and the scope development really begins back in the programming screen, and the report. Again, that purpose and need, the project need, really drives the PD&E study. It also identifies, again, what are the engineering analysis and documentation that's required, as well as any environmental studies and documentations, any permit that's anticipated, and resolve any dispute resolution issues before entering into PD&E. So just a recap again, in the identification of the project need. Early coordination and early effort through the planning screen onto the programming screen with the advanced notification, the class of action determination, and in preparation for your scope of service to enter in the PD&E. So it's in two different documents here. You have the ETDM manual and then the PDD manual. So all those are documented in those two manuals. So identification of the project need. Looking at the manual describing the purpose and need in the project description chapter, part 2. Looking at the area-wide need, how is it in relation to the system and the deficiency of the local governments and other community desires. And then looking at the project corridor need itself, is it a capacity issue, the safety issues, any specific desires from the community? Looking at all the different databases, whether again, if it's a deficient pavement, other things that we want to look at, drainage issues that we may be aware of, we want to bring that all out and identify those as the needs for the project. So in identifying the project need, when you go through the PD&E process or the project, a project that involves access to interstates or an interchange goes through a separate process that runs generally concurrent to the PD&E, and that includes any interchange justification reports as for new interchange or modification of an interchange that will require an interchange modification report. Or multiple interchanges, which again is looking at a system interchange modification report. And that's all included in the interchange access request user guide that's also available on the website. So a separate but concurrent process that may run if you have a project that does include an interstate or an access to a limited access facility. So just a quick overview of some of the things that you needed through the PD&E, looking at the aerial surveys, traffic data, data collection, development of those alternatives, drainage analysis. So some of these are just the engineering process and the flow of everything. And we'll go a little bit in depth later on to each one of these elements. So from there, we also look at the environmental analysis, taking it to alternatives workshop, and then refining those alternatives. So once we refine those alternatives, we're going to identify the recommended alternatives to take to public hearing. And after that, we go and get our NEPA approval. And that's generally the whole overall process of a PD&E study, getting the data, doing the traffic, developing the concepts, further analysis of the environmental impacts, alternatives, and then the recommended alternative, taking a public hearing, and NEPA approval. One important thing that you want to do here is go out to the field. You know, prior in scoping the project, you know, visit that project. It's important to get the feel of the area. Look around, look at the land uses, the businesses, the type of buildings, what are the conditions of pavement, you know, any bridge structures. You know, so identify those issues early on. It's nice to see something on a GIS view or even on pictures, but it's nothing better than going actually out to the field to visit it. And like I said, I recommend going out there prior to advertisement, scoping it out, because that will also help in the development of the scope of service. Look around, you know, see who might be impacted, what community is. So the issues, you know, how can we remedy those potential issues, and what concerns that you might have with adjacent owners. You know, I always like to stop by the local grocery store in the area and kind of look, because you can get a feel of the residents, you know, and the makeup, because generally people don't have to drive, you know, miles away out of the neighborhood to go shopping. So that's one quick way to look at the community. What is the makeup of the people and even what they sell? You know, sometimes you have a Publix subway down here with Hispanic items and stuff like that. So then you may know that we may need to have some you know, materials with different language, with limited English proficiency and stuff. So the preparation of the scope of service. You know, the standard scope of service is all up there in the program management, the design support, and the scope. You know, identifies the description of project objectives, the public involvement activities, and the engineering activities, environmental activities, and then documentation is required. It also identifies what technical studies is required and the number of alternatives for the project, and also the level of public involvement. And one important thing that you want to know here is, you know, make sure that you're using the most recent scope of service that's available online. So don't use, you know, a previous study scope of service and rework it, or, you know, or something like that. So always use a fresh, clean scope. And for the Environment Management Office, we produced a brand new scope of service for the PD&E that integrates, you know, that SWOT process into the program, and it's an interactive kind of program that helps you develop that scope of service by identifying what class of action it is, and then what is involved, and then it really generates a scope of service for you once you answer those questions. So having the ETDM, you know, going out to the field, getting that, you know, the coordination with the different offices will help you answer those questions to produce that scope of service for the project. So this new tool was effective just last month, which is like, you know, developing that scope of service through this. There's also a SWEP tool, which is the statewide environmental project tracker, in order to access the scope development tool here. And if you don't have access to SWEP, you can make that request, especially the project manager should have access to SWEP. So in addition, or in conjunction with the scope of service, we also have the DOT standard staff hour estimation guidelines that's also available on that website, and looks at the different elements of the task, the staff hour ranges, what's included generally in that task, and the different ranges, whether it's a low range, mid range, or high range. And again, you know, for just like design or anything else, it's meant to be an average. So there may be projects that requires less effort, and there may be other projects that requires a little bit more effort than even a high range project. So looking at the guidelines when you're developing the staff hour for negotiation, and also the estimation for the project cost. So when you're negotiating with your consultants, again, using the standard man-hour ranges and the forms, and also what's in that scope of service that was developed from the programming stream, and utilize the mutual gains negotiation. If you don't know what mutual gains is, I'm sure we'll have another series discussing the different things, but it's trying to get the best product. Have either, again, with added additional tasks that wasn't identified that may be needed, or again, getting a savings from all the effort that we've already done previously prior to entering the PD&E, that we have the information the consultant may not have, and we negotiate to get the best bang for the buck, basically.
Hey, Dad, this is Bobby. Yeah, we're actually going to have our negotiations webinar probably coming up. I believe that's going to be our June presentation. So, yeah, it's a good point to bring up. We'll get into it a little bit more in the next couple months.
Very good. So exactly, this whole series is going to take you a little bit more in depth. This webinar here is just geared more towards the PD&E, but the DOT process, again, the scope development, the negotiation, everything it's all in this series that we're developing now. So thank you, Bobby. And everything, project schedule is also a critical element. We have a saying here that, what gets measured gets done, or you probably all heard that. And it begins with, having a project schedule developed in Primavera and also in the PSM. The specific PSM codes for PD&E project that should be all utilized and filled out, because all these things are tracked through that SWEP tool that I mentioned earlier, and the activities are being met. Identification of the start date and finish date. Also track your critical path items throughout the project. And really keep up to date on those critical path items, because that may delay a project. And recommendation again to review your production meetings to make sure that you're on track. So these are some of the PSM codes, and a little bit of guidance, but every one of these items should be, again, depends on the class of action that you have. Some of these may be relevant and others not. But have enter these PSM codes for your project and the beginning and end dates for each one of the projects. And again, it is now being tracked for all projects, and it's being reported to the executive office, and how we're performing with this NEPA assignment. They had estimated there would be a savings, especially without the federal review and streamlining of the process, that we should realize a savings, not only through the SWAT process, but also the NEPA assignment. So you'll see that those PSM codes reflects back onto the activities that we're tracking and the actual completion date. So each for the schedule, again, each district should utilize the template for the different class of action is to be used on all the projects. So it also helps you to understand the flow of the information and the relationship, because again, if you're not keeping up with those critical path items and there's dependent items, it could hold up the whole process. So it tracks both the PDD and the pre-PDD activities. And it, of course, it can always be modified based on the context of the project. Again, if you have an interchange or even a 4F, that's a separate process that goes concurrent with that. But you must include these PSM codes on all of your projects, though. So just a look at a Gantt chart type schedule, looking at the activities, how the relationships. So that's a good tool to look at what's needed prior to the next activity and moving forward and tracking those critical path items that's in red. So just another view of the standard schedule template, looking at a different format, a tabular format with the beginning, end dates, and other activities. So. And this also helps you identify in what elements, if it's public involvement, what are those activities that's going to be occurring within there. So you've done a lot of work up front, getting the aerials, the survey should be done up front. That's one item, a couple items that can be done ahead of time. Going into data collection and the data collection phase, again, we're analyzing what the existing conditions, getting the existing roadway plans, straight line diagrams, and the right-of-way maps, crash data, the bicycle, any bicycle pedestrian facilities, drainage maps, existing traffic volumes, the pavement condition. These are all the things that we need to be collecting to analyze our baseline or the no build. Okay, and if the project includes a bridge, you have to do an additional data collection as what is the type of structures, getting the existing structural plans, the bridge condition, the rating, vertical, horizontal clearance, span arrangements, and if there's any historical significance of that bridge. And if a bridge crosses over a waterway, you have to collect additional data. That's also required to, especially if it's a navigable channel. Getting the channel data, the alignment width, depth, the required clearance, vessel surveys, what type of vessels, the height of the vessel sometimes, and if it's a movable structure, the number of openings, any ship impact, scour data, how critical is that structure. So again, there's a lot, depends on the scope of the project. You'll have to look at what data is needed to be collected. And then environmental data. What's the land uses, the existing proposed or future, any cultural features, community services, police stations, schools, any archaeological or historic features, natural biological features, if there's any wetlands, any known contaminated sites, and then doing the existing noise, the background noise along the project, getting the social economic information, and getting a general feel of the community. What's the views, any opinions and stuff like that. So. And again, if you guys have any questions, if anyone have any questions throughout this, please either raise your hands or type into the thing and we'll address it. So again, it's back down to the project manager, okay? It's critical to have that project manager involved early on in the development of the scope to make sure that all the information that's required is collected. Okay, so that may require coordination with other offices, but again, once the PD&E begins with that scope, you as the project manager is responsible for that. So early coordination and identification is critical here because we don't want to have to go back to collect any additional data, especially once the project already began. Then the next step that we have to do here is the project traffic. So with the project traffic, we want to make sure that we're following the project traffic procedure and the traffic analysis chapter in the PD&E manual. Looking at any previous traffic study that was done What is the traffic methodology? How are you collecting it? How are you analyzing it? Again, the traffic forecast. And you want to use the forecasting handbook to do that. And then you're going to develop the project traffic analysis report. See that PTAR, another acronym, the measure effectiveness. So the traffic data and analysis establishes that design traffic volume. So when we're looking at design traffic, we're looking at 20 years after opening is basically your design year. So you're looking at addressing the traffic in opening year. You may be required to do is interim years, which is basically in between 10 years from opening to design year. What is the annual average daily traffic, the design hours, the level of service, and you may be even looking at in what year does it hit level of service F. Another thing with traffic data is looking at noise. When you're looking at the noise analysis, you're looking at level of traffic, level of service C. What is that traffic volume for that? And doing any pedestrian counts, vehicle counts, classification counts, bicycle counts is also included in here with the traffic analysis. Again, follow the manual uniform traffic studies when you're doing the traffic analysis and the methodology that's documented there. So once you have the traffic, then you're going to develop and design your alternatives based on those design traffic, and developing those alternatives that meet the need of the project as well as the traffic condition. And you want to look at the other design controls when you're developing those alternatives, looking at the classes, the roadway classification, what is the design speed, the required level of service, any vertical clearance, lane width, horizontal, vertical control, and try to meet those standards first off. And as you develop the concept and the alternatives, again, it is based on that purpose and need for the project, meeting those design standards, always looking at the no-build condition and the transportation system management and operations strategies. That's a toolbox. It's not just ITS, it's other elements, in that TSM&O toolbox that you can utilize on your alternatives, the multimodal alternatives, and the various build alternatives. And it could be a combination of in a build alternative with the TSM&O strategies. And everything should be consistent with the long-range transportation plan to make sure that we're meeting our planning consistency. So with the build alternatives, you're looking at what are the benefits and also the adverse effects of doing no improvements or any improvements. Describe how those build alternatives addresses or doesn't address the needs. And you want to always carry forth that no build alternative throughout the entire study. So I talk about the build alternatives and the criteria is again, if you're refining an alternative, that's a refinement on alternative, not necessarily a new alternative. So that's one thing that you really want to be aware of and keep that in mind. You're not studying a new alternatives, you're just refining that one original alternative. So talking about TSM&O, try to maximize and utilize the efficiency of the facility. It may be, active transportation or traffic controls. It could be, arterial ITS. So there's many other different tools that you can use in that TSM&O toolbox to help maximize the efficiency of that roadway. And looking at, managed lanes is one element of that TSM&O, or express lanes. And the multi-modal alternatives, looking at the, bus services, rails, transit, and how it interconnects and connects to one another. Because again, it's the people carrying capacity of the roadway, not necessarily only the vehicular traffic, but also the carrying capacity is something that we want to look at, and maximizing the people throughput. So with the build alternatives, you want to look at all reasonable alternatives. Again, it has to meet the purpose and need identified for the project, and only the feasible alternatives are evaluated in detail. And that goes through a comparative alternatives evaluation matrix to screen those alternatives. So with the build alternative, you want to establish those control criteria, the functional class, again, design speed, the season high water, what is the shoulder width, median width, the grade, slope, horizontal, vertical clearance, and everything. So, and you can also utilize to minimize the impact is utilize, the design variations and exception process to try to minimize and avoid some of those impacts if possible, looking at the build alternatives. So again, I mentioned earlier, it's iterations of the alternative, looking at the best alternative that will minimize and avoid any impacts, and also, number one, meet the purpose and need of the project. And that may include having TSM&O alternatives or strategies that can be utilized in conjunction with. And again, I said, identify where we can do those variants and exceptions as needed, but always start off with the required standards first. And keep with a consistent naming convention when you're doing an alternative. So like I said, if you're doing an alternative 1 and you're doing iterations of it, it'll be alternative 1A, B, etc. And then do number 2. So it doesn't become, you're doing alternative 1 and then an iteration of it becomes an alternative 2, and then it becomes alternative 3, and you had an alternative 3 in the previous screen. It gets really complicated to follow. So make sure that it's a consistent naming convention that someone else that's reading that document can follow. And generally, we lay out these alternatives on a base map, utilizing aerials and survey data. And why do we do that? Is for the public. Basically, when we do these alignments on an aerials and you present this to the public, the first concern is, does that impact my property? If the person lives down here, it's like there's not going to be any impacts, or there may be some with the ramps. But the first thing then is, I live right here. How is this project going to be impacting me? And you can easily identify it based on the overlay of the alternatives on an aerial map. So once the alternatives are developed, you begin to analyze a little bit more in depth the drainage, also examine the environmental impacts, look at the watershed and any regional opportunities that you may look at, whether it's joint use ponds and whatnot. So the environmental impact is analyzed based off of the alternatives that you develop to try to minimize the impacts of those alternatives to the environment. So the environmental analysis, and we'll go a little bit more in depth here, looking at the social impact. Again, all the environmental data collection was also collected up front, okay, as your baseline. So you should have already know where those wetlands may be, and already try to avoid those things. But With the analysis, you're going to get a little bit more in depth, looking at the social impact, any relocation potential, cultural resource, wetlands, essential fish habitats, any farmlands, noise. And one of the things with these environmental analysis is that through the programming stream, the resource agencies and the ETAP members have already identified if there's no farmlands, you're basically not going to do any analysis on farmlands just to prove a negative. Okay, they've already told you there's not going to be any impacts, and so you just briefly document it, but no further detailed analysis should be required when you do that. So you'll take those alternatives, after refinement and avoidance and mitigation efforts that we've done with alternatives, and take that to public workshop. So the alternatives workshop, we'll look at, again, an initial impact that we identified and hold that public workshop, present the alternatives, gather public comments, which really helps to refine those alternatives. Because oftentimes, the people that are potentially affected by the project, knows what are the critical issues within their areas. One thing I did not mention here earlier is, prior to alternatives workshop and those refinement is, again, if you have a value engineering, again, if it triggers, then you should do the value engineering study prior to alternatives workshop. From there, you want to look at the evaluation matrix, identifying the level of impact or the level that the alternatives may have on some of these resources, looking at, say, the number of businesses to be relocated, there's any impact to any community facilities, the impacts to, floodplains, the noise, the engineering costs, the design costs, and then any high-risk contamination site also should be identified. So this really helps you to evaluate the different alternatives based on the evaluation criteria. So yeah, we're just zooming in and looking at some of those elements that I mentioned, and we're trying to quantify on the same level for each alternative, so that you can either rank it or rate it based on the level of impacts or benefits to a project. So. Again, utilizing not only the physical impact or the human impacts, but also the natural impacts and the cost. So it's not strictly based on cost or environment or something. So it's a balance, and some people actually utilize you can weigh some of these impacts. So it's a very critical habitat. You might want to give a little bit more significance if you want to quantify these things to certain things, so give it a little bit more weight, and that kind of balances out when you're doing an evaluation matrix. Then you'll refine those alternatives after you get into public inputs and also the environmental screen impacts, and you want to refine those alternatives. So you incorporate into public comments, any minor adjustments to alternatives as necessary to avoid and try to mitigate if necessary, and then come out with the one alternative that will become the recommended alternative. And I also mentioned again, you still want to carry forth that no-build alternative, because that's your baseline and what you're comparing to, and it has to meet that purpose and need. So here was my value engineering slide, but it should come again. You try to look at these prior to alternatives, because your value engineering is potentially another alternative that you want to look at. And the value engineers are required for bridge projects that are over $20 million, and if there's anything above $25 million on federal projects. So you want to hold this again before the public hearing, schedule this with your value engineering team. So generally, it consists of a week-long event, looking at the value engineering report and the mitigation or acceptance of those value engineering elements that was identified, and it's all summarized within the preliminary engineering report. Another thing with value engineering is cost risk, identifying those. So that's another process. And if there's any major project, any projects over $500 million, also needs to go through the process, which is a different one for a major project. So looking at all those impacts and the alignments and engineering, we're going to identify our recommended alternatives. So again, identifying the recommended alternatives involves all that public comment from, whether it's from kickoff or scoping through alternatives workshop and the public hearing comments and any other public meetings that you may have had. Refining those alternatives, again, this is an iterative process sometimes. Again, trying to minimize and avoid as much of the environmental impacts as we can. But again, the alternatives drives the environmental analysis. And then any additional input that you may have, and then you want to recommend the build alternative. And again, that build alternative is taken to public hearing, as well as the no build alternative. And then we bring that recommended alternative to public hearing. So public hearing, we present, again, the recommended alternative and the no build, meeting the purpose and need of the project. And public hearing is required for projects or for the ones that require a public hearing. And a public hearing is, again, another opportunity for the public to voice their comments. At this stage, it's not really, we're not trying to answer because there should be an open session, but we're just there to really listen and get those, and it should be recorded with a court reporter, and the transcript should be all included in the final thing. So we should have public comment sheets. There's a whole bunch of different public involvement activities that you can do for the public hearing. Again, generally is an open house session, so we can answer and address any comments. The presentation, and then a public comment period. And oftentimes, the team is still available after the formal public hearing to answer any additional questions. And there's usually a 10-day period preceding the public hearing to receive any additional public comment. So after public hearing, we have their selected recommended alternative. Again, the decision can be made on whether we're moving forward with a build or no build of a project. And we document everything to package it for approval, which again includes the public hearing transcript. If it's a category type 2, the CE2 is prepared, as well as if it's an environmental assessment, then the EA, which may always lead to either a finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, or be elevated to an EIS or environmental impact statement. And the environmental impact statement is the highest class of action, so that may be done as well as if it's a state only here. We can do the State Environmental Impact Report, or SEER. That goes also along with all the environmental technical studies. So these are the final documentation, and the draft documents, almost the same thing with the exception of the final environmental docs, are available for public review prior, before the public hearing. So for the engineering, you have the preliminary engineering report with the project traffic analysis report, PTAR, any safety analysis, typical sections, any design variation exceptions that was identified, the preliminary plans, the right-of-way dimensions, the right-of-way needs, any files, correspondence, in the change, modification or justification report, bridge hydraulic report, pond siding report, and any other technical report are prepared generally as appendix or an reference to the preliminary engineering report here. So the final recommended alternative is the one we really do a little bit more detailed engineering and the final the plans. So looking at whether if we're going to superimpose those on aerial photos, typical sections, any special design elements, and also the project cost, including any right-of-way costs, construction, and mitigation of that project. Environmental summary. We want to address any issues that was raised again in the planning stream, programming stream, and we should address all those because it should be written inside the scope of service to be done. We summarize all the environmental impacts and identify any permits if applicable, because we have to make sure that whatever we propose can be permitted, and in order for it to be built. So the public involvement summary summarizes all the community outreach program throughout the project, identify any issues that was raised by the community and how we address those things, and the final public hearing transcript, the official transcript of the public hearing is included. Commitments and recommendations. So commitments made or commitments kept is one thing. We want to be sure, when we say we're going to do something, we're going to do that. And everything is documented through this project commitment tracking form. So that's also included in the document. But the commitments is a living document. The commitments that we made here in PD&E goes on to the next phase, whether it's right-of-way phase or design, construction, maintenance, and there may be additional commitments, or commitments can be retired if we've addressed it. But we want to make sure that we track it and who is the next the next party to receive it. So it's good practice to meet with the, if you're going through a PD&E, meet with the design folks, let them understand that these are commitments that we made, and they're going to be able to abide by this, or is this something they can live with, or cannot, or we cannot do. So those things should be discussed prior to making, and finalizing the project commitment. And these commitment trackers is kept throughout the project in the commitment tracker report. So again, additional technical reports. Again, I mentioned again, if it's an interchange, a separate process, bridges, navigable bridges, as well as the typical section package. And we're taking this, we've already identified to the NEPA approval. So, we've taken this to public hearing, identified all those alternatives. So this is the whole overall process, early efforts to be done prior to starting the PD&E, the data collection, getting the traffic, alternatives, additional engineering analysis, environmental analysis, taking it to a public workshop, refining those alternatives, identifying the recommended, and now again, once it's gone to public hearing, and now we go taking it, now it's the preferred alternative. So the name changes. So be careful also the usage of the naming of the alternatives from a recommended alternative, and then in this case, after public hearing, it becomes our preferred alternative for the NEPA approval. So just be mindful of that and the technical differences between those alternatives. And NEPA approval, the PR along with the environmental documents is submitted to the Office of Environmental Management for approval because, again, we did get the NEPA assignment for FHWA on all NEPA studies, and that was effective December 14 of last year. And all the reviews and approval of NEPA documents are now approved by our Office of Environmental Management. And we should, hopefully, if everything goes smooth, we get our ultimate goal here is to get that location design concept acceptance, or LDCA. So NEPA assignment, again, just a broad, brief overview of NEPA assignment. The FDOT has assumed all legal responsibility and the liabilities that goes along with to make sure that we are in compliance with the environmental requirements. FHWA would no longer have any project level involvement on a NEPA project. However, FHWA will still be involved in engineering and operational activities. So we should not be consulting FHWA on any project related NEPA. And they still can be, talk, but always coordinate through your liaison through the OEM, or Office of Environment Management, on all of NEPA related questions. So again, FDOT administers everything that's been assigned through the NEPA, any federal laws, executive orders, and our OEM will approve that document, NEPA, including the NEPA process that goes through with any lab projects. And with that, I have this is my contact information. I can be reached on the phone number there, 305-470-5201, or by email at dat.wynh, dot.state.fl.us. And again, the manuals are available online at these two sites. Make sure that you always refer to the manual. And again, if you're doing the scope of service, I just want to again make sure that you do go back to the program management or the project management support and always utilize the most recent forms that are available there. So, Bobby, any questions or anything? We're open for questions now. And if you have any other questions, later you can always email or contact Bobby or Brian. There's their contact information here. So if there's any questions, I'm ready to take it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dad. That was great. We did have a couple questions on presentation material. We are going to be having, that should be available by next week in Learning Curve. We are going to take the, right now I'm just about versed enough to start getting things posted up in Learning Curve, which would include the webinar, a course survey, and any of the materials, which would include a copy of the PowerPoint, also these links. And they'll be all located when you go into Learning Curve. On the left-hand side, there'll be a resources tab. In that resource tab will be all of the links mentioned. Additionally, when Dat was going over, utilizing the standard scope of services, the OEM had a webinar a couple days ago going over the brand new template, updated information, and I'm going to provide that link as well, so you can go and view the information that was provided by the group up here in Tallahassee. And also be looking for having everything posted for webinars 1, 2, and 3 online as well, to where if you have new staff or someone who hasn't been able to make the live webinar sessions, they can go directly in there to view the webinars and receive their credit. So, excuse me. As far as that's the rest of the questions. Everyone who attended today should be receiving their credit in their transcript within the next week. So if you don't see it, just shoot me a message, but I should have that done. Brian, was there anything else you'd like to follow up with?
Well, sir, that was fantastic.
Great. Thanks again, Dat. And thank all of you for attending. And we will be in touch in May for our next webinar series. And we'll probably be looking at the third or fourth week in May. So I hope all of y'all have a great day and a great rest of the week, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.